for the rail industry to do this voluntarily on their own, driven by the market, whatever terminology they want to use. This is absolutely an area that's crying out for government intervention.
Okay. Senator Ricketts.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Jeffries, it's just been described about the locomotives and the claim that the railroads are not replacing their engines. Do you have a knowledge of what would the estimate be of the average lifetime of a locomotive? I mean, how much do they cost and how long are they expected to last?
An average locomotive costs about $4 million and upwards of 40-year lifespan. If I could make one comment on the investment discussion that occurred. The rail industry I mentioned in my opening statement invests about $25 billion of its own dollars every year. And the result of that is the highest rated infrastructure of any type in this country as graded by the American Society of Civil Engineers. And again, that's privately owned, that's privately maintained. It's not federally owned, it's not nationalized, because take a look at that type of infrastructure. Take a look at the Northeast Corridor. It's at about a $100 billion investment deficit. This industry invests almost 19 cents per revenue dollar. That's 6 times more than the average industry. And so I don't want to hear that this industry isn't investing. We can talk about the turnover of the locomotive fleet, and absolutely that's something we're interested in. That's why we have been out in revenue service when it comes to battery electric, when it comes to hydrogen. That's why we're deploying different types of power in our yards to reduce emissions. And it's just, it doesn't add up that the investment's not occurring there. And we're happy to have that discussion about a new federal standard, absolutely, but it needs to be done in an achievable manner.
You know, and also one of the things that Mr. Rosen said was that at the time the new regulations came out in 2014, it was estimated, and I presume it was by the EPA, that 30% of the Class 1 railroads would have Tier 4 engines by 2023, which is just next year. Was the railroad industry consulted, do you know, as part of those estimates? I mean, I can tell you based on my experience with the EPA, they don't talk to industry when they make regulations, but I was not personally involved in any of this. Do you have any knowledge of this by chance?
I certainly can't speak to the level of consultation or engagement that occurred. I know that based on my experiences with some other estimates that have occurred with other agencies, what's said and what's real doesn't always add up. But again, you know, we're investing literally billions in either the modernization of locomotives, new types of locomotives, and any sort of mandate or forcing into purchasing Tier 4s right now. For those that want to get away from diesel, all that does is lock in diesel power for the next 4 decades. So we're focused on the beyond. I think that's one area that Mr. Rosen and I can agree on, is that we do need to continue development of battery electric and we would say other alternate sources of power. And we should all be working together toward that goal and figuring out the best way to get things into the marketplace at a faster clip.
Yeah, and if I could just add on, talking about biodiesel and renewable diesel, which also reduces emissions, as we talked about, the EPA set their goals in the RVOs, the renewable volume obligations for the oil industry, at below what the current industry is actually producing. So once again, the EPA not talking to industry. But let's talk a little bit about now the catenary system that was described before for the electrification of it. What are your thoughts on this? I mean, describe a little bit what would be some of the challenges to go to an electric system. Wouldn't you have to, again, build this through every one of those 144,000 miles you were talking about?
Absolutely you would, and you'd have to develop the power stations and power sources along those. Often, as you know, the great state of Nebraska, we operate across very rural areas where power sources aren't readily available. That's grid development that we would be responsible for. You're talking about hundreds of billions of dollars, so you'd have to rework tunnels, rework bridges, thousands of bridges, never mind what needs to be done on the locomotives themselves. Certainly, it works well in urban areas up and down the Northeast Corridor. Absolutely. You know, I take the train every time I go up to the Northeast. But across a 142,000-mile network, in a network that locomotives from one rail operate across another company's lines all the time, everything has to be interconnected, everything has to function seamlessly. That level of an endeavor, one, it's not realistic, and two, it doesn't make sense for the future.
And the estimate to do that per mile, do you know?
I think it's in the millions.
And do you know, has anybody actually put pencil to paper to do the calculation to say, hey, if we were going to electrify this entire system, how much power generation would we need and how long would it take to do it?
I would venture to guess that no one has contemplated that, and it's a leap of faith unlike any other.
And do you know how long, assuming we could meet the power generation standards, do you know how long it would take to actually do something like that if you were going to try and do it?
Decades.
Okay, great. Thank you very much, Mr. Jeffries. Mr. Rosen, kind of the same question to you. Has anybody done the calculation to know how much power generation we would need if we were going to electrify the entire rail system?
There's actually somebody in this room who has done a lot of work on that from an organization called Solutionary Rail, who have some very creative ideas about how to do it. I will agree this would be a project for the entire nation that would probably take decades. It's probably the kind of investment that our country needs to do. Whether the individual railroads will be willing to do that left to their own, or whether it has to become something that the government has a direct role in, is another question. And it also doesn't require putting catenary on every single mile, because you can use the battery electric locomotives for some in-between sections. They can get well charged in the sections where you have the electric lines up, and then coast through the other areas on the battery electric, including places like tunnels, et cetera. And it does require probably rethinking the electrical grid. We need to do that anyway as a country. We are converting our entire power system in this country. We have to. This is not about, does it cost too much money or not? This is a question of, what's it going to cost the human race if we don't electrify everything?
Great. Well, I see I'm out of time, Mr. Chairman. Thank you.
Thank you. The senator from California, Senator Padilla.